Brian Welker's story didn't begin with his recent promotion or the tension in his marriage. Years earlier, he had been at the center of an unexpected crisis when Harding Containers faced a significant environmental compliance issue. The company had been cited for improperly managing waste materials, and layoffs loomed as regulators pressed for expensive upgrades. Brian, known for his attention to detail, uncovered a crucial mistake in the paperwork submitted by a third-party contractor. His discovery saved the company from heavier fines and earned him an unsought reputation as a problem solver among the management team. This wasn't Brian's first brush with high stakes. A few years before Tim was born, Brian had been in a serious car accident while driving back from a friend's bachelor party. A drunk driver had veered into his lane, causing a collision that left Brian with a fractured arm and lingering anxiety about night driving. Though he recovered physically, the experience instilled in him a deep sense of caution and responsibility, traits that later defined his approach to fatherhood and work. In the early days of his marriage to Brenda, they faced an unexpected hurdle when a tornado tore through their neighborhood, leaving their small apartment heavily damaged. For weeks, they lived in a motel while sorting through insurance claims and salvaging what they could from the wreckage. The ordeal brought them closer as they relied on each other to rebuild their lives. At the time, Brian felt confident they could overcome anything together. When Tim was a toddler, Brian's younger brother, Charlie, struggled with dependence and briefly moved in with the family. Brian took on the role of mediator, balancing his brother's needs with the well-being of his wife and child. Though Charlie eventually sought treatment and turned his life around, the strain placed on their household left an indelible mark. Brenda, in particular, resented the intrusion and often brought up how much the situation had disrupted their lives. One of Brian's proudest achievements came during Tim's elementary school years when he designed and built a custom playground for the school as part of a community service project. Using his skills as a machinist, Brian volunteered countless hours fabricating equipment and overseeing its installation. The playground became a beloved fixture in the neighborhood, and Tim often boasted to his friends about his dad's handiwork. Despite his dedication to family and community, Brian had a quiet passion that few people knew about: restoring vintage motorcycles. Tucked away in the garage was a partially restored 1972 Triumph Bonneville, a project he worked on sporadically during his rare moments of downtime. He often dreamed of finishing the bike and taking long, solitary rides through the countryside, a goal that seemed increasingly out of reach as the demands of life continued to pile up. Brian Welker wiped the sweat from his brow, a faint smile creeping onto his face. Earlier that day, he'd been promoted to shift supervisor at Harding Containers, a milestone he'd been striving toward for years. The position came with added responsibilities, but working the night shift was a perfect fit. It meant he could attend his son Tim's school events and games during the day without compromising work. During work nights before, Brian knew he could manage the adjustment. With a few paid days off before starting his new role, Brian decided it was time to tackle a project he'd been putting off for ages: converting the space above his detached garage into a livable apartment. His vision was simple: a quiet haven where he could sleep during the day without disturbances. But before he could get started, there was an issue to solve. The Wi-Fi signal didn't reach the garage. Determined to fix it, he climbed into the attic to run a cable and strengthen the connection. As he carefully fed the cable through the crawl space, a faint noise caught his attention. The house was supposed to be empty. Brenda was at work, and Tim was spending the day with his grandparents, but the sound was unmistakable, coming from the bedroom. Brian froze, his pulse quickening, and crawled toward the source, moving as quietly as possible. Through an old unsealed vent in the attic, Brian caught sight of something that shattered his world. Brenda was in their bed with another man. Stunned, he stared in silence, his heart pounding as he tried to process what he was seeing. Shaking with rage and disbelief, he reached for his phone and began recording the betrayal, ensuring he captured both their actions and words. "I like this arrangement," the man said smugly. "Your husband doesn't even touch you." "Don't bring Brian into this," Brenda responded, her voice strained with guilt. The man, Bill Grant, a delivery driver Brenda worked with, and the divorced father of one of Tim's classmates, continued, "You're literally in his bed, Brenda. What does that say about us?" Brenda sighed, uneasy. "I don't know why I let you convince me to do this. We could have gone to your place. It would have been safer. But where's the fun in that?" Grant replied, laughing, "The risk, the thrill, it's what makes it worth it." Brian's grip tightened on his phone as he watched the scene unfold. The man's arrogance, Brenda's betrayal, the casual mockery of his trust. It was unbearable. Yet he stayed silent, forcing himself to remain calm. He had all the proof he needed. Once the house fell quiet, Brian climbed down from the attic, his mind swirling with anger, sadness, and disbelief. Brenda hadn't just been unfaithful. She'd systematically disrespected him, shutting him out of their marriage while sneaking around with another man. It wasn't just an affair, it was a deliberate rejection. Later, standing under a hot shower, Brian allowed himself to confront the truth. His marriage was over. Brenda's betrayal had destroyed any love or trust he once had for her. But he wasn't going to let her actions ruin him. His focus shifted to Tim, who still had 2 years of high school left. Brenda could live however she wanted. Brian no longer cared. The garage apartment, once imagined as a peaceful retreat, became the centerpiece of his plan to reclaim his independence. That evening, he reached out to contractors to discuss turning the space into a fully functional living area, complete with a kitchenette and bathroom. With his new promotion, he could afford to outsource the work and save himself the time and stress. For the first time, Brian realized the true value of his time. Pinching pennies for the future no longer mattered, especially since half of everything he had might eventually go to Brenda. From now on, his priorities were himself and Tim. By the time Tim left for college, Brian intended to have a solid plan for his next chapter, one where he wouldn't tolerate being disrespected ever again. When Brenda came home that evening, Brian was seated calmly at the kitchen table. He studied her as she walked in. She looked different, older and heavier than he remembered. How had he not noticed before? "You're home early," Brenda remarked, surprised. "Yeah," Brian replied coolly. "Something came up at work. I'm starting night shifts tonight, so I came back to rest before heading out." "You're being assigned to work nights after a day shift?" she asked, feigning concern. "You should get some sleep." "That's the plan," he said evenly. "I'll wash the bedding," she offered quickly, likely recalling the state of their bed from earlier that day. "That's not necessary," Brian replied. "I'll sleep in the guest room." That evening, Brian left the house as if heading to work, but instead, he drove to a nearby sports bar. There, he enjoyed a baseball game and a couple of drinks, clearing his mind. When he returned home, Brenda was already asleep. Quietly, he parked in the garage and spent the night on an air mattress in the unfinished apartment, sleeping better than he had in weeks. The next morning, one of the contractors he contacted responded with a reasonable estimate and an immediate start date. The team could begin work on Monday and finish in just 2 weeks. Wasting no time, Brian signed the contract. As he envisioned the space taking shape, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. It was the first step toward building a new life, one free of betrayal, with a future he could finally control. On Sunday evening, Brian began his first shift as a supervisor. His schedule ran from Sunday to Thursday nights, with the plant closed on Friday and Saturday. Knowing this, Brenda was surprised the next night when Brian opted to sleep in the guest room. "Why are you sleeping in the guest room?" she asked. "We won't see much of each other while you're on the night shift. Why not sleep in our bed?" "I worked last night and got a few hours of sleep this morning," Brian explained. "I'm trying to adjust to staying up at night and sleeping during the day. I don't want to disturb your sleep." Brenda frowned slightly. "Unless you think we should, spend time together," Brian teased, raising an eyebrow. Her reaction was predictable. For a brief moment, she froze, then forced a faint smile. "I'm really tired tonight," she said. "Maybe we could just cuddle." "Hugs don't help me," Brian said bluntly. "If I hold you, I'll want more. If it's off the table, I'll avoid temptation and stay in the guest room. Don't bother making excuses. I'm not the type to force anything." "I know," Brenda replied quickly. "I'm just tired. I hope you understand." "Oh, I understand perfectly," Brian said. "Let me know when you're in the mood. If I feel the same, we'll see. Good night." With that, he walked to the guest room, leaving Brenda puzzled. On Saturday, Brian spent the day playing catch with Tim and doing yard work. That night, he returned to the guest room, further confusing Brenda. Sunday evening, Brian arrived early for his shift as supervisor. Confident in his ability to handle the role, he didn't bother telling Brenda about his promotion. She kept secrets from him, so he saw no reason to share his own. The shift went smoothly, and Brian quickly adapted to the new responsibilities. When he returned home Monday morning, Brenda was already at work, and the construction crew was busy renovating the apartment. After confirming plans with the foreman, Brian went inside to sleep but was interrupted by the noise and a ringing landline in the guest room. Groggily, he answered. "Hello, Brian, sorry to wake you," his mother-in-law Beverly said. "Is that why you called?" "Check if I was sleeping," Brian snapped. "No need for attitude," she replied. "Bill and I know you're on night shifts. Let us know if you need help with Tim." Brian hung up and unplugged the phone, muttering about people's cluelessness before drifting back to sleep. By Friday, the apartment renovations were complete, a feat that amazed Brian. The crew had finished in just 4 days, a task that would have taken him months. That afternoon, he purchased furniture, including a bed, a small kitchen table, a sofa, and appliances like a TV, refrigerator, oven, and microwave. As he admired the progress, Brian felt a renewed sense of control. The apartment marked the start of a new chapter, one where he prioritized himself and what truly mattered. By Monday afternoon, Brian was confident his new apartment would be ready for full-time use. He chuckled, recalling Brenda's confusion when she arrived home to find workers busy at the garage. Pulling her aside, she demanded to know what was going on. "I'm having the apartment over the garage finished," Brian said. "I need a quiet, insulated space to sleep during the day while working nights. No noise, no interruptions, and no landline. This way, I won't disturb you or Tim, and you won't even notice I'm nearby." Brenda frowned. "You're my husband and Tim's father. We should notice you're nearby. I'll take Tim to his practices and games, and we'll have family dinners. That's important." Brian smirked. "I told you to let me know when you're in the mood for love, but you haven't taken me up on it." Brenda scowled. "You're acting ridiculous. Marriage is about more than spending time together. It's about conversation and connection. Spare me the lecture." Brian shot back. "I've done plenty for this marriage. Just let me know when you're ready to be served. I'm not livestock," Brenda snapped. "You'll apologize and take me out for a proper evening first or forget it." Brian grinned and walked away, leaving Brenda both irritated and confused. Though she'd managed to stop Bill Grant from pushing her into more risky encounters, Brian's aloofness unsettled her. Once attentive, he now ignored her, which made her worry. Still, she believed he wouldn't go long without wanting her. She decided to wait for an apology, convinced his interest would return. By Wednesday, Brian had fully moved into his apartment. The upcoming Labor Day weekend gave him 3 days off, with Tim's school starting Tuesday. "How about we go to the Diamondbacks game on Saturday?" Brian asked over dinner. "They're playing the Dodgers, and it's a big game for the pennant." "That's awesome." "Thanks, Dad," Tim exclaimed. "I don't like baseball," Brenda grumbled. "I'll stay home." "I'm sure you'll find something to do," Brian said pointedly. "It's settled. Tim and I are going. Can I tell Scooter?" "He's so jealous," Tim said. "He's a Dodgers fan." "Invite him," Brian suggested. It's more fun with friends. Thanks, Dad, Tim said, rushing off to call Scooter. You made Tim's day, Brenda said. Baseball's a good way to bond with boys. Scooter's polite. Wait, his real name's Horace. Brian laughed. Poor kid. His dad passed away 2 years ago, Brenda said, ignoring the comment. They moved here to be near family. I'll stick with Scooter, Brian replied as Tim returned, beaming. Scooter's mom said, Yes, he's coming with us, Tim said excitedly. Brian smiled. It's going to be a great game. On Saturday afternoon, Brian parked his truck in front of a tidy ranch-style house. Before the engine stopped, Scooter ran out and jumped into the truck next to Tim. Mr. Welker, my mom wants to meet you first, Scooter said with a grin. She probably wants to make sure you're not a serial killer. Sorry. No problem, Brian replied, stepping out and ringing the doorbell. A slender woman around his age answered. Though plain-looking, her toned legs and jogging shorts caught his attention. Let me guess, you think my legs are my best feature, she said playfully. Brian hesitated, then laughed. Well, they are impressive. Do you think I should let my son go to a baseball game with someone who stares at women? She teased. I'm trying to raise a gentleman. Brian decided to play along. I'll teach him to appreciate the farer's efforts and to be subtle about it, he said with a grin. Well, as long as he learns to respect women and defend himself from anyone calling him Horace. We're good, she said. I'll make sure of it, Brian joked. By the way, what do your friends call you? Gertrude. Unless you're one of my male friends, then it's Minx or Bubbles, she replied, laughing. Minx it is, Brian said, smiling. See you later, Minx. Take care of my son, she said, still laughing. He can go with you anytime. The game was a success. Scooter caught a foul ball, and both boys overindulged in hot dogs and soda. On the way home, they fell asleep in the back of the truck. At Scooter's house, Brian walked the drowsy teen to the door, where Gertrude greeted them with a smile. He might have had too many hot dogs and sodas, Brian admitted. That's what baseball games are for, she replied warmly. Thanks for taking care of him. Here's a great kid, Minx. See you at the next game, Brian said, heading back to his truck. Brian quickly settled into a routine. He slept soundly in his newly insulated apartment from 9 a.m. to 3 p.m., thanks to thick curtains and soundproofing. Brenda occasionally complained about him staying in his man cave even on weekends, but she dropped the subject whenever he asked if she needed his services. Brian suspected her real concern was avoiding Grant and getting caught. Her reluctance to rock the boat suited Brian perfectly, as it kept their marriage intact until Tim graduated. Since Brian's new role as a foreman came with fewer physical responsibilities, he decided to purchase a home exercise machine marketed as providing a total body workout. Much to his delight, the machine delivered on its promise, as long as he stayed committed to using it regularly. Meanwhile, he made it a priority to attend all of Tim's baseball practices. The coach noticed Brian's involvement and started assigning him to work with some of the kids on the sidelines, while the coach focused on the team as a whole. Tim was already a skilled player and continued improving steadily, but the biggest surprise was Scooter. At the start of the season, Scooter showed some potential but struggled with confidence and seemed hesitant. Determined to help, Brian spent as much time as he could with him, dedicating weekends to extra training sessions at the local park. Since Brian's relationship with his wife had grown distant, he figured channeling his energy into baseball was a productive way to manage stress. Over time, Scooter's confidence grew and his performance on the field improved dramatically. By the middle of the season, Scooter was excelling as a shortstop and hitting consistently. Meanwhile, Tim solidified his role as the starting center fielder, batting third in the lineup. Brian felt an immense sense of pride in both boys' progress. One thing Brian couldn't ignore was the increased attention he was getting from some of the other kids' mothers. His jokes seemed to land a little too well, drawing laughter that lingered longer than expected, and his efforts with the team often received glowing praise. Some mothers even baked treats for the group, but always ensured Brian got a special portion, no matter what was made. As Tim's bond with Scooter grew, so did Brian's connection with Scooter's mother, Gertrude. She struck Brian as intelligent and witty, and they began spending more time together. One afternoon, curiosity got the better of him, and he decided to ask her about the recent attention he'd been receiving. "Gertrude, can I ask you something a little personal?" Brian began cautiously. "You're not about to ask my bra size, are you?" Gertrude quipped without missing a beat. "What? No, I wasn't going to ask that," Brian stammered, taking it back. "Well, men usually preface personal questions like that," she teased with a sly grin. "Fair enough," Brian conceded with a laugh. "But what I really wanted to know is if you've noticed how some of the moms have been acting around me. Don't they seem, I don't know, a little extra friendly?" Gertrude smirked. "You're just now catching on. Let me spell it out for you. The friendliest moms on the team, they're all single. To them, you're a great dad, a nice guy, and gainfully employed. That makes you prime real estate in their eyes. But I'm married," Brian pointed out. "Wouldn't that be a deal breaker?" "They're aware," Gertrude explained. "That's why nobody's made a serious move yet. But it doesn't mean they're not interested. Nobody's crossed a line, right?" "No, nothing like that," Brian replied. "But still, I'm not available. End of story." Gertrude hesitated before continuing. "I hate being the one to tell you this, but we're friends, so here goes. Everyone knows Brenda is cheating on you. And there's a rumor that she's cut you off entirely. Word is, your marriage is on borrowed time, and these women are just waiting for the breakup to swoop in." Brian was stunned. How could anyone know something so personal? "Who's been talking about my private life?" "That's Grant," Gertrude replied. "Brenda must have told him, and he couldn't keep his mouth shut." "Do you mean Brenda or her lover?" Brian asked. Gertrude joked, trying to lighten the mood. "Seriously, though, you don't look too shocked. Did you already suspect Brenda of cheating?" "I didn't suspect it," Brian clarified. "I knew. I caught them together in our bed." Brenda raced all out. Gertrude was incredulous. "You walked in on them, and you stayed married. You didn't confront him or her?" "No, I decided my priority was Tim. I wanted to be there for him. So staying in the same house with Brenda seemed like the best way. I moved into the apartment above the garage under the pretext of needing quiet for my night shifts. Brenda wasn't thrilled, but Grant convinced her that any closeness with me would mean he'd lose access to their bed. That was enough to keep her away from me." "That's insane," Gertrude fumed. "Brenda's behavior is awful, and Grant sounds like a complete idiot. For what it's worth, every single mom on this team thinks you're a cash." Brian shook his head with a faint smile. "You're overestimating my appeal. I'm just a regular guy." "Don't sell yourself short," Gertrude countered. "You're smart, kind, and great with kids. If I weren't so plain and reserved, I have already made my move." Brian chuckled. "Thanks for being honest with me. I had no idea I was the talk of the team, or that so many people knew about my situation. It's humiliating." "You're doing your best to be a good dad, and that's admirable," Gertrude said firmly. "And for the record, Horace thinks you're pretty cool too." "Who's Horace?" Brian asked with a playful grin. "Only someone as clueless as you would tease me about Horace after everything I've said," Gertrude replied with a smile. "You're a great friend, Gertrude. Thanks for setting me straight," Brian said. "I just hoped Tim doesn't pick up on too much," she added. "He knows something's off between you and Brenda. He'll figure it out eventually." Gertrude hesitated before adding, "You know, Scooter's got a crush on Heather Grant. It's awkward, but she's a sweet girl. Too bad her dad's such an idiot." "Let's hope Tim sticks to Holly Ingram," Brian said. "At least that's a drama-free option." "Holly's definitely got her eye on him," Gertrude agreed. "And she's a good kid from a good family." Maybe something nice will come out of this mess. 2 nights later, Tim's team faced off in the first round of the district championship. As the game drew near, Brian realized he was probably more anxious than his son. Adding to his discomfort, the usual trio of single moms seemed particularly determined to grab his attention. Norma Wilson had chosen a stylish top that showcased her features, frequently leaning toward Brian under the pretense of picking something up or looking for something nearby. He couldn't deny that she had an impressive presence. Brandy Dorn, on the other hand, opted for a snug sweater that highlighted her slim waist and graceful silhouette. While she didn't show as much skin, her form-fitting outfit ensured she caught Brian's eye. She kept him engaged by asking countless questions about the team and its players. Then there was Jillian Patterson, who was the least subtle of the group. She stood so close to Brian that her presence frequently pressed against his arm or side whenever she spoke to him. Amused, Gertrude handed Brian a soda and a hot dog before retreating to her usual spot near first base. Shortly after, Brian noticed that all 3 women abruptly left his side at the same time. He found it odd until he heard a familiar voice behind him. "Well, look at this," Brenda announced loudly. "I decided to join my husband today and watch my son play. I didn't realize I'd have to wade through his fan club to get to him." "What's going on, Brian?" she added, her tone sharp. "The game hasn't started yet, but Tim did great during batting practice," Brian replied, carefully steering the conversation away from her implied accusation. "Nice dodge," Brenda snapped. "What's with all these women swarming around you like bees to honey? It's good you don't have a silicone allergy. If you're asking me to explain the mysteries of the female mind, you're out of luck," Brian said with a shrug. "I don't have a clue." "Honestly, I'm surprised to see you here," Brenda replied firmly. "Tim's playing an important game," Brian remarked. "Of course I'm here to support him, though clearly some of the other moms are here for more than just their kids," Brenda continued. "You've been too busy for Tim's games before," Brian remarked. "How'd you manage to fit this one into your schedule?" Brenda stiffened at his pointed comment, momentarily wondering if he was hinting at something. The thought quickly passed. If Brian suspected anything, he'd be far more confrontational. One thing she was certain of: Brian wouldn't tolerate betrayal. If he knew, she'd have no doubt about it. "I made time," Brenda said coolly. "This game is important to Tim, and that makes it important to me. Plus, it's been a while since I've seen you with your night shifts, so I figured we could cheer him on together." As they settled into the bleachers, Brenda noticed several other mothers glancing in her direction, their expressions less than welcoming. She couldn't understand why they seemed hostile. This was her first game, and she'd barely spoken to them. Then she spotted Gertrude sitting nearby. Unlike the others, Gertrude wasn't flashy, but Brenda couldn't help but notice her toned legs and shorts that seemed a little daring for the cool evening weather. The game soon began, and Brian's attention shifted entirely to the field. After 2 quick strikeouts, Tim stepped up to bat. Brenda's nerves spiked when the first pitch flew dangerously close to Tim's head. The second pitch, though low and outside, was met with a solid swing. Tim sent the ball flying, landing a stand-up double. Next, Scooter came to the plate. Brenda was struck by how much he'd matured. He seemed stronger and more self-assured than the shy boy she remembered from the previous summer. The first pitch zipped near Scooter's head, but he stood his ground, preparing for the next. Brian chuckled softly. "Trying to scare these two is a bad call," he muttered, almost to himself. "I just hope the pitcher tries to sneak a fastball past Scooter." The pitcher delivered, adding extra power to his throw. The sharp crack of Scooter's bat meeting the ball echoed through the stands. The crowd erupted as the ball sailed over the center field fence. Tim jogged home, grinning as he exchanged high fives with Scooter at the plate. Gertrude beamed, her pride evident. Glancing at Brian, she saw tears glistening in his eyes. She knew how much time he'd spent helping Tim and Scooter improve their skills. The joy and pride he felt were palpable. She was deeply grateful for the impact Brian had on Scooter's confidence and growth. Brenda, however, sat stiffly, her attention divided. Her unease grew as she watched Brian and Gertrude, while also noting that the two women who had previously hovered around him were now retreating. Elsewhere, Brenda's lover Bill was growing impatient. "Are you seriously telling me you haven't spent time with Brian since the day we hooked up at your house?" he asked incredulously. "You are the one who suggested I avoid him for as long as possible," Brenda shot back. "He started working nights, moved into the apartment above the garage, and now we barely even say hello, let alone anything else." "That's insane," Bill said. "He's too young to just give up on sex. Either he's interested in someone else, or he's got someone else on the side. Brian is not interested in anyone else, and he's definitely not looking for someone else," Brenda insisted. "He's just focused on work and Tim's games. That's all. No normal guy would willingly give up a relationship like you," Bill argued. "There's no way he isn't getting attention somewhere." "Brian is a man of principle," Brenda replied defensively. "He'd never betray me like that. And what do you think you're doing with me?" Bill shot back. "This is different," Brenda said, her voice softening. "It's just a little fun, something temporary. Brian's been so busy, and I deserve to enjoy myself too. I work hard at my job and taking care of the house. I've earned this." Bill smirked. "Fine, have it your way. We'll enjoy it while it lasts. Just let me know when I can really claim you. The thought of you in our bed still drives me wild." As Brenda replayed Bill's words in her mind, unease settled over her. She couldn't help but notice the two women who had been hovering around Brian slowly dispersing. It was impossible to ignore that these women were attractive, with enviable figures and confidence to match. Brenda realized she had to take action if she wanted to safeguard her marriage from potential threats. Her eyes fell on Gertrude, seated alone nearby. Inspiration struck, and Brenda decided to act quickly. Flashing a warm smile, she approached and sat down beside the surprised woman. "It's great to see you again, Gertrude," Brenda began cheerfully. "Horace has turned into such a talented baseball player and such a sweet boy. You must be really proud." "I am," Gertrude replied cautiously. "Tim's doing great too. All that time Brian spends with them has really paid off. He's been an incredible mentor to Horace." "Brian does have a knack for that," Brenda agreed, her tone turning strategic. "But sometimes he's almost too good. I'm sure you've noticed how those blonde women with, well, generous assets are always swarming around him. I need your help with something." Gertrude tilted her head, clearly intrigued. "What exactly do you have in mind? Should I hose them down when they get too close?" Brenda laughed lightly. "Not quite. You know I can't always be here for practices and games because of work. But I trust Brian around you. You're not his type at all. If you could just stay close to him when I'm not here, it would mean a lot. I'm going to tell Brian to stick by your side, so those manipulative women think he's focused on you. It might be awkward at first, but you'd be helping to protect my marriage." Gertrude's eyebrows shot up. "Let me make sure I've got this straight," she said dryly. "You're worried that these attractive single moms might seduce Brian, so you want me to act as a decoy. Obviously, you think I'm safe because I'm, what, plain and reserved." Brenda protested. "That's not what I said," Gertrude replied. "I just know Brian. He's far less likely to develop feelings for someone like you than for some former cheerleader with a perfect figure. This is about keeping him faithful." Gertrude leaned back thoughtfully. "Tell me something, Brenda. If Brian did cheat, would it be a deal breaker for you? Or could you live with him having a fling as long as you stayed as number one?" "I hope you're joking," Brenda said, her tone sharp. "I love Brian, but infidelity would be the end. It's not just about the act. It's a betrayal of our marriage vows. I'd never tolerate it. Once that line is crossed, the marriage is over. Surely you understand that. You were married for years. You know what loyalty means." Gertrude nodded slowly. "I get it. Cheating does undermine the entire foundation of marriage. I can see why you feel that way." Brenda softened. I appreciate you understanding. So can I count on you to help? Just keep an eye on him when I can't. Oh, absolutely, Gertrude replied with a sly smile. Be sure to explain all this to Brian, though. I'll do my part. Who better to keep a man faithful than someone as trustworthy as me? Brenda smiled, ignoring the sarcasm. Thanks, Gertrude. I knew I could trust you. With that, she stood and headed off to join her husband. I practiced the next day. Brian brought it up. Brenda wanted to talk last night before I left for work. Long story short, she thinks I'm surrounded by too many attractive single moms. Her solution? She wants me to stick close to you, Minx, or as she calls you, Gertrude. Gertrude laughed. Why don't I feel safer? You know as well as I do that no one is truly safe around any person, no matter how ordinary they might seem. Minx, you're one of the most beautiful women I've ever known, Brian said sincerely. You're the full package, not just some superficial combination of bleach and implants. Gertrude blushed, looking both amused and flustered. Well, you just made my job a lot harder. I'll have to schedule an eye exam for you once baseball season's over. Brian chuckled. You'll find my vision is perfectly fine. I just seem to have misjudged one thing, my wife. Gertrude smirked. Maybe she misjudged us too, assuming you're serious about finding me attractive. Brian laughed softly at her reaction, spending much of the practice joking and chatting with her. The other parents noticed, and their reactions ranged from disbelief to disappointment. In just one session, Gertrude's presence had effectively set him apart from the crowd. The team's next game required a 3-hour trip to Middleburg. To ensure the boys were well rested, they decided to travel the night before and stay at a hotel. Brian gave a ride to Jake Winston's parents and Gertrude, and much of the drive was spent discussing the team's prospects in the district and state championships. When they arrived at the hotel, Brian helped the Winstons with their luggage. The parents volunteering as chaperones were staying with the team, while others had to find accommodations elsewhere due to the high number of visitors in town for the games. Before Tim joined the rest of the team, Brian reminded him to behave and assured him he'd be there for practice the next morning. What hotel are you staying at, Minx? Brian asked as the Winstons checked in. The same one as you, she replied simply. I never mentioned where I'm staying. How do you know? Brian asked, puzzled. I didn't, Gertrude said with a mischievous smile. Brian shook his head, still confused as they arrived at his hotel. Minx, why don't you see if there's a room available while I check in? I'll wait to make sure you find something. No need, Gertrude replied, grinning. I'll be fine. Only when Brian returned to the truck with his room key did things begin to click. He looked at Gertrude. Would you like one of these keys? I'm in room 207. What a thoughtful offer, she said with a playful smile, taking the card and kissing him lightly on the cheek. Now let's get settled. We've got a long night ahead of us. The next morning, Brian woke up feeling even more exhausted than when he had gone to bed. As the reality of breaking his marriage vows hit him, he wrestled with his conscience. Fortunately, Gertrude, affectionately nicknamed Minx, helped him process his emotions. Let's look at this rationally, Minx began. Brenda not only cheated on you, but agreed to cut off your physical relationship. Even if she hadn't, she's putting your health at risk by having an unsafe relationship with her lover. She's essentially made closeness with her unsafe and undesirable. That alone frees you from your vows. Plus, I haven't been with anyone in over 2 years, and I've been tested. I'm clean. You were tested after finding out about her affair, so I know you're fine too. I've even been on the pill for over a month, hoping this would happen. Can you give me one valid reason why we shouldn't be together? Or is it just that you don't find me attractive? Her voice softened as she continued. Your wife picked me as a decoy because she thought I was plain and wouldn't appeal to you. Am I really that undesirable? Minx, don't ever say that, Brian said, his tone firm. You're incredibly attractive. I've never cheated on Brenda before, so this is an adjustment for me. But you make a strong case, And I'm ready now, he added with a small grin. There's something you should know first. Minx said. Her expression was serious. Both of my parents are in hospice care and don't have much time left. Also, my brother has been sharing Horace's baseball footage with a friend who coaches at one of the top prep schools in Los Angeles. If Horace earns a scholarship for next year, we'll probably be moving back. I like you a lot, Brian, but we can't plan for anything long-term. This can't last forever. You're a married man whose wife has been unfaithful, and I'm a single mom focused on giving my son the best opportunities. I have to put Horace first. I'm happy for Scooter, Brian replied sincerely. He's a great kid and a talented player. He deserves to play at a top-tier school and get a great education. You've done an amazing job raising him and giving him this chance. The irony, Minx said with a wry smile, is that your mentorship gave Horace this opportunity, but it also means we might have to leave you behind. Brian paused thoughtfully. I don't think I'm built for a one-night stand. Maybe it's better to give up entirely than to experience it once and go back to being alone. You're ridiculous, Minx said with a laugh. I said we probably move in 6 months. That's plenty of time for us. Unless, of course, you think you're too old for 6 months of amazing companionship with a very eager woman. Well, I guess we'll just have to find out, Brian teased. Think you can live up to your nickname, Minx? Oh, I'll show you exactly why I earned it, she promised. Just whistle when you need me. I'll even teach you how to whistle properly. I've always been told I'm pretty good at whistling, Brian joked. Then you're doing it wrong, Minx shot back with a smirk. The baseball team went on to win the state championship, and Scooter earned a scholarship to a prestigious prep school in California. Just before Thanksgiving, both of Gertrude's parents passed away within a week of each other. Brian and Tim attended their funeral, where Brian met Gertrude's brother. Brian, this is my brother Dexter, Gertrude introduced. Dexter, meet Brian, Horace's mentor and our good friend. Dexter. Seriously, Brian said, surprised. Yep, her brother replied with a grin. Only Gertrude and my parents call me Dexter. Everyone else knows me as Grim. What do you call her? Brian asked. Scamp, Grim said. Don't ask me why. I don't think I need to. Thanksgiving brought Brian back to Brenda's parents' house with Tim. That evening, as they prepared for bed, Brian found himself in an unfamiliar position. Brenda seemed interested in rekindling their relationship. It's been a long time, Brenda began, slipping into bed. You must be missing this. Let's reconnect. Brian hesitated, his response laced with sarcasm. Are you finally admitting you need some attention? I knew you'd come around. I'd be happy to put a smile on your face for the holiday. Her expression darkened instantly. You're such an idiot. With that attitude, don't expect me to try again anytime soon. Okay, Brian said simply, rolling over. Though his remark was uncharacteristic, it achieved his goal, avoiding closeness with Brenda. Still, it saddened him to see how far their marriage had deteriorated. Brenda lay awake, troubled by his comment. Was he aware of her affair, or was he just frustrated by their lack of closeness? She resolved to talk to Bill, her lover, about it. She needed to keep up appearances with Brian to avoid raising suspicions. Brian's routine while working the night shift remained consistent. After finishing his shift, he had a small breakfast and went to bed by 9 a.m. By early afternoon, Minx often slipped into his bed. Her intentions were clear. They'd spend an hour together before she left to be home when Horace returned from school. With baseball season over, Brian found more time for himself in the evenings before work. Despite the complications, this arrangement worked well for both Brian and Minx for the time being. One evening in early December, Brian had just settled into his shift at work when his phone buzzed. It was Tim. Dad, Scooter, and I are hanging out with Heather and Holly in Heather's car. You said we could stay out until midnight since there's no school tomorrow, but we've got a problem, Tim said, his voice anxious. Heather was driving her mom's car. And we got a flat tire. There's no spare in the trunk. We're stuck on D Street, and it's making me nervous. A few guys at the arcade across the street keep looking over here." Brian's frustration was immediate. "Are you seriously stuck on D Street near the arcade?" He snapped. "We'll talk about this later. Is Heather driving that Corolla?" "Yeah, it's a 2017 Corolla," Tim confirmed quickly. "All right," Brian said, calming himself. "I'll find a tire and be there soon. Keep the doors locked and don't get out. If anything happens, call the police. Look out for those girls, okay?" After hanging up, Brian headed to the production floor in search of a solution. Spotting Gus operating a forklift, he walked over. "Gus, you've still got that Corolla, right? I need a tire that'll fit. And I need it now." Gus looked up, surprised but cooperative. "Yeah, I've got a real spare, not one of those flimsy donuts. Let's grab it and go." As Gus got ready, Brian saw Jack Reynolds walking by. Jack was Holly's uncle, her mother's younger brother. "Jack," Brian called out. "Tim and some friends, including Holly, are stranded on D Street with a flat tire and no spare. Gus has a tire, and I'm heading over there now. Can you come with me?" Jack's face tightened with concern. "Absolutely. Let's go." The three men hurried out to Gus's car, all aware of how dangerous that area could be at night, especially for teenagers. Meanwhile, Brenda was lying in bed, basking in the afterglow of her time with Bill when his phone rang. He glanced at the caller ID and groaned. "It's Heather. If I don't pick up, she'll give me hell for ignoring her," Bill muttered as he answered. Brenda could only hear his side of the conversation, but quickly became uneasy. "What are you kids doing there?" Bill demanded. "Well, that's tough. You boys are old enough to handle a flat tire. Call AAA or something and tell your mom to put a spare in the trunk next time." After hanging up, Bill dismissed Brenda's curiosity. "Nothing serious," he said casually, reaching for her. "Heather got a flat, but she said, A day A is handling it." Back on D Street, the tension was thick. A group of young men loitered near Heather's car as Gus's vehicle pulled up. Brian wasted no time grabbing the jack and tire iron from Gus's trunk and getting to work. Gus brought the spare tire, and Jack approached the driver's window, motioning for Heather to roll it down. "Stay in the car," Jack instructed firmly. "We'll handle the tire. If those guys get any ideas, we'll take care of it. Holly, you're going to have a lot of explaining to do when your mom finds out you were here." Brian positioned the jack under the car and secured it in place. As he started loosening the lug nuts, one of the men from the group swaggered over, clearly looking for trouble. "You're on our turf," the man sneered. "You don't touch anything without my say-so." Before Jack could reply, Brian swung the tire iron into the man's legs with a sharp crack. The man collapsed, groaning in pain. Brian dragged him by the collar, pinned him face down near the flat tire, and sat on his back while continuing to work. Two others from the group rushed forward, but Jack intercepted the first, landing a solid blow to the man's head and knocking him to the ground. The second hesitated as Gus stepped forward, his imposing presence enough to make the guy think twice. "Keep cranking the jack," Brian said to Jack calmly, as he finished removing the flat tire. The thug beneath him tried to squirm free, but Brian grabbed a fistful of his greasy hair, pushed his head back to the pavement, and growled, "Stay still." With the new tire in place, Brian tightened the lug nuts and gestured for Jack to lower the car. As he stepped over the gang leader to return the tools, his foot accidentally landed in the man's groin, earning a pained howl. Brian turned to the rest of the group, casually tossing the tire iron from hand to hand. "You guys have something to say?" he asked, stepping forward. The gang scattered without another word. "Get out of here," Jack told the teens firmly, "and stay out of this neighborhood. You're lucky this time." The men climbed back into Gus's car and followed Heather's vehicle until it reached a safer area, then headed back to work. "You really cracked that guy's legs?" Gus asked, laughing as they drove. "He went down like a sack of potatoes." "Thanks for letting me tag along," Jack said, rubbing his arm. "That punch felt good, but I'll probably feel it tomorrow." "And you sitting on him while changing the tire." "Classic," Gus added, grinning. Their late-night adventure had become the talk of the plant. Tales of courage and quick thinking were always a hit, especially on the night shift, providing a welcome distraction and plenty of entertainment for everyone. The next morning, Brian woke up groggy, only to find Minx slipping into bed beside him. She kissed him deeply, her intentions unmistakable. She was completely without clothes, her desire palpable. "Horace told me what happened last night," she said breathlessly. "You were amazing, Brian. Thank you for taking care of the kids. You've earned this. I would have come earlier, but I had to wait for Horace and Tim to head out. They're visiting the girls since there's no school today." Meanwhile, Brenda had barely been at work an hour when Sue Blaine approached her at the water cooler, eager to share something. "Did you hear about last night?" Sue began, her voice low but animated. Brian, Jack Reynolds, and Gus Benson apparently stepped in to deal with some troublemakers maltreating the kids on D Street. Word is, Brian didn't hesitate to use a tire iron to teach one of them a lesson. Brenda's stomach dropped as the pieces fell into place. Last night, Heather had called her father for help, and Bill had brushed her off like it was nothing. Clearly, the situation had been more serious than he'd let on. Sue's use of the word kids confirmed that Tim, Holly, and Horace had been there too. Fainting in disbelief, Brenda replied, "That's quite a story. What exactly have you heard? I want to make sure the rumors are accurate." Sue recounted the tale in vivid detail, and by the time she finished, Brenda was seething. Beneath her calm exterior, anger burned. At Bill for abandoning his daughter in her moment of need, and at herself for getting involved with such a selfish, irresponsible man. While Bill ignored Heather's plea for help, Brian and his coworkers had stepped up to protect the kids, putting themselves at risk. That was what real men did. The contrast was stark and painful. The realization hit her like a freight train. She had been cheating on Brian, her husband, a good man, with someone who wouldn't even lift a finger for his own daughter. What had she been thinking? Brian was 10 times the man Bill would ever be, and deep down, she'd always known it. Later that morning, Brenda found Bill in the break room casually enjoying a snack while his delivery truck was being serviced. Without hesitation, she confronted him. "Heather called you for help last night, and you just ignored her," Brenda demanded. "Those kids were in a dangerous situation, and you told her to call AAA. What kind of father does that?" "Relax," Bill replied dismissively. "Your husband and his buddies handled it. Everyone's fine. So what's the big deal?" "The big deal," Brenda shot back, her voice rising, "is that Brian acted like a man while you sat here doing nothing. My son was in that car, and you couldn't be bothered to help." Bill smirked, unfazed. "If your husband's so great, why are you sleeping with me instead of him?" Brenda's temper snapped. "You're pathetic. Brian's more of a man than you'll ever be. This thing between us, it's over. Don't speak to me again." "Your loss," Bill said coolly, leaning back in his chair. "Plenty of women would eliminate for what I bring to the table. When you change your mind, you know where to find me." Brenda turned and stormed out, tears stinging her eyes. She had betrayed her husband and risked her family for a man who didn't even care about his own daughter. She could only pray Brian never found out how foolish she had been. She knew she had a lot of work to do to fix her mistakes. Back at Brian's house, Minx had just finished dressing when she noticed Brenda standing in the doorway, her face streaked with tears. "How could you do this to me?" Brenda cried. "I trusted both of you, and this is how you repay me." Minx, unfazed, calmly reached for her shirt. "I'm just following through on your plan," she said lightly. "You wanted me to keep those manipulative women away from Brian, so I made the ultimate sacrifice. Mission accomplished." "I never wanted you to spend time with him," Brenda shouted, her anger boiling over. "And Brian, you cheated on me with this plain, reserved little "Watch it," Minx interrupted sharply. "Your husband was struggling," she said calmly. "I was just helping relieve the pressure you and Bill created." "Speaking of Bill, where is he?" "Warming your bed while Brian was out saving your son." Brenda froze, her face flushing. "You know about Bill?" "Oh, everyone knows," Minx replied briskly. "You've been with him for months. You stopped spending time with your husband because Bill didn't want to share." "How generous of him." Brenda's voice dropped to a whisper. "If Brian knew, why didn't he confront me? Why did he let it go on for so long?" Minx crossed her arms. "Think about it. What do most men do when they find out their wife's cheating?" Brenda swallowed hard. "They get angry, probably leave, maybe file for divorce." "Exactly," Minx agreed. "What's next, Brenda? Do Brian and Tim stay here while you move in with Bill?" Minx asked, her tone calm and matter-of-fact. "I wouldn't move out of my house," Brenda replied firmly. "And I wouldn't give up custody of Tim, either. If Brian wanted a divorce, he'd be the one to leave," Minx stated. "He'd still have to pay alimony and child support, and Tim would stay with me." "That's precisely what Brian anticipated," Minx said with a nod. "His priority has always been staying close to Tim and being the best father he can." "How do you think he managed to achieve that?" "Because he won't divorce me," Brenda admitted, her voice dropping. "He stayed for Tim, not for me. When he found out about Bill and me, it was like he divorced me emotionally. We've been living as strangers under the same roof for months now. I was just too blind to see it," Brenda continued. "To be fair, Bill made it easier for you not to notice," Minx pointed out. "Then I came along, just a reserved woman, as you've called me. After you'd already burned the bridge with Brian, I'm the one helping him move on," she concluded. "I told Bill it's over," Brenda said firmly. "I don't want anything more to do with him." "Let me guess," Minx replied with a hint of sarcasm. "That realization hit after he blew off Heather's call for help last night. You didn't have much of a choice, did you? Are you and Brian planning to move in together now?" Brenda asked, wiping her tear-streaked face. "Not at all," Minx said plainly. "We're happy with things as they are. Besides, Horace and I will be moving back to Los Angeles before school starts in the fall. I'd prefer if my son didn't know his mom was, let's say, having a fling with his best friend's father. When the time comes, I'll probably help Brian find someone new if he wants my input." "What if I don't let this continue?" Brenda said, her tone defiant. "He's still my husband. You have no right to spend time with him," Minx replied, her voice calm but sharp. "You forfeited that right the moment you started spending time with Bill. That effectively freed Brian from any obligation to you," she continued. "Unlike you, Brian and I can trust each other. If you can even imagine that, he knows he can't be with you or anyone else as long as I'm here. That's the deal." Brenda's face crumpled as tears began falling again. "Who knows what Bill has done behind my back?" she said shakily. "What if he's been with someone else? What if I've put myself at risk?" Her voice broke as the realization set in. "I need to get tested." Minx's expression didn't soften. "Smart idea," she said coolly. "What happens now?" "We keep things as they are," Minx said with a shrug. "I'll visit Brian when I can. You keep working late and avoiding him. If it isn't broken, why fix it?" "I can't do that," Brenda said firmly, her voice gaining strength. "You're leaving in a few months. I'll stay and show Brian that I can be the partner he deserves. He won't need you anymore." Minx smirked. "Except he knows my reserved nature, as you like to call it, has been loyal to him, unlike yours, which has been out there waiting for anyone willing to spend time with it. Honestly, I control your private life, or at least the part involving Brian. I won't let him get near you as long as we're together. I don't want to risk anything." Brenda straightened her shoulders, forcing confidence into her voice. "Relationships are about more than just being together," she said. "Being together without love or commitment is hollow and degrading. I'll do everything a partner should do for their spouse while you're just a fling. Let's see where that leaves you." Minx raised an eyebrow. "Fine," she said, amused. "You cook him a fantastic meal, take care of the house, and make sure his clothes are clean. Meanwhile, I'll make him smile in private. We'll see which of us he prefers." Brenda turned to Brian, her voice trembling with desperation. "Brian, I'm so ashamed. I'm sorry for everything I've done to hurt you. Can you ever forgive me?" Minx interjected, her tone cutting. "Forgiveness is one thing. Trust, that's a different story. How do you plan to regain his trust after you've destroyed it?" "That's the problem every partner faces," Brenda said. "Here's my advice. Enjoy the next few months while you're still Brian's spouse in name only. Use that time to reflect on what you gave up for something temporary with Bill. Once Tim graduates, Brian will likely show you the door," Minx concluded. Brenda turned back to Brian, pleading, "Why do you let her speak for you?" Minx answered for him, her voice steady. "Because I'm not just his friend. I'm his best friend. While you were off whispering sweet nothings to Bill, Brian and I were building a real connection. Now, if you don't mind, could you leave us? We have things to discuss." She pressed a finger to Brian's lips, signaling him to remain silent as Brenda reluctantly left the room. Thanks to everyone who took the time to listen to today's stories. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking and subscribing if you haven't already. Feel free to share your thoughts on the events in the comments below. Take care.